I'm Grace Harper, 28 years old, and the memory of that moment when I hobbled into the Denver courtroom will remain etched in my mind forever. The rhythmic echo of my crutches striking the polished marble floor seemed to amplify in the tense silence. My heart was racing, hammering against my ribs as I prepared to face my family members, who sat there with expressions of smug satisfaction, completely convinced they had already secured their victory. But I watched as their confident eyes suddenly widened in shock and disbelief when they caught sight of me alive, standing upright despite the sharp, stabbing pain that radiated through my injured leg. Yet it was the woman walking beside me, offering her quiet support, who caused my father to bolt upright from his seat, his face draining of all color as he cried out, "Oh my God, it's her." The entire courtroom seemed to freeze in that instant. They had been certain they had buried my future forever in that sterile hospital bed where I lay alone in a coma, discarded and abandoned as though I meant absolutely nothing to them. They truly believed they could simply take everything I had worked tirelessly for, including my $10 million contract, the crowning achievement of my entire life's work. But they were completely mistaken. If you were in my position, would you make them pay the price for what they did, or would you offer them an opportunity to make amends and set things right? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let's have this debate together. It all began several months before that dramatic courtroom confrontation. I had just emerged from a sleek, modern office tower in downtown Denver, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I gripped the freshly signed contract. $10 million. My revolutionary AI algorithm, a genuine breakthrough in the field of medical diagnostics, had successfully secured me a lucrative deal with a major healthcare corporation. Years upon years of late nights spent hunched over my computer, endless sessions of complex coding, and constantly pushing myself past my own doubts and insecurities had finally paid off in the most spectacular way. I was 28 years old, a software engineer operating at the absolute peak of my career, and I simply couldn't contain my excitement to share this incredible news with my family. I drove through the familiar streets to our comfortable suburban home, my heart pounding with an overwhelming sense of pride, my mind filled with vivid images of their faces lighting up with joy and excitement when I told them. But I couldn't have been more wrong about what awaited me. When I pushed through the front door and stepped into the foyer, my sister was already there, seated at the kitchen table with her posture rigid and her eyes narrowed into suspicious slits. She was 32 years old, working as a project manager at the same company where I was employed, always impeccably dressed, always projecting an image of complete control and composure. But on that particular day, something felt distinctly off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I held the contract up high, unable to suppress my proud grin, and announced enthusiastically, "I did it. $10 million for my algorithm." Her lips twitched slightly, but not into anything resembling a smile. Instead, her expression twisted into what could only be described as a grimace of pure resentment. "Your algorithm?" she snapped back sharply, her voice cutting through my excitement like a knife. "You mean the one that I've been overseeing and managing? The one that I personally pushed through countless meetings and presentations?" Her voice was absolutely dripping with venom and contempt, and I found myself frozen in place, stunned by her reaction. I had always been aware that she possessed a competitive streak, having grown up watching her claim the position of the golden child who consistently received our parents' praise and approval while I scrambled and fought for even the smallest scraps of recognition. But this reaction was something entirely different. This wasn't just competition or sibling rivalry anymore. This was pure, unadulterated rage burning in her eyes. I attempted to explain calmly that the algorithm was entirely my work, my original code, the product of my countless sleepless nights and dedicated effort. She abruptly stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor with a harsh screech, and stepped aggressively closer to me, invading my personal space. "You think you're so much better than me, don't you?" she hissed through clenched teeth, her face contorted with anger. I instinctively backed away, raising my hands in a defensive gesture, desperately trying to calm the rapidly escalating situation. "This isn't about you," I managed to say, though my voice was noticeably shaking with fear and confusion. But she wasn't listening to a single word I was saying, completely consumed by her fury. We had somehow moved to the top of the staircase during our heated argument, our voices raised, her face positioned mere inches from mine, close enough that I could feel her breath. "You're absolutely nothing without me," she spat with vicious intensity, and then in a sudden flash of movement that seemed to happen in slow motion, her hands violently shoved against my shoulders. I stumbled backward, my foot desperately reaching for solid ground but finding only empty air, and the entire world seemed to spin wildly around me as I fell. Excruciating pain exploded through my head, my body violently crashing and tumbling down the hard wooden steps, each impact sending fresh waves of agony through me, and then everything faded into complete darkness. When I finally managed to open my eyes again, I found myself lying in a hospital bed, the steady, monotonous beeping of various medical machines filling the otherwise oppressive silence. My head was throbbing with an intense, pulsing pain, my leg ached with a deep, persistent soreness, and a nurse's gentle voice managed to cut through the thick fog clouding my mind. "You're awake," she said softly, her tone carrying a mixture of relief and professional concern. I blinked repeatedly, struggling desperately to piece together the fragmented memories and understand what had happened to me. "How long?" I managed to croak out, my throat feeling painfully dry and raw. 2 weeks, she replied carefully, her eyes reflecting kindness but also a certain guardedness. 2 full weeks in a coma. I immediately asked about my family, questioning whether my sister or my parents had been there, had come to visit, had shown any concern whatsoever. The nurse visibly hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, then finally said, "No one has been here to see you. Your parents called once very early on, just after you were admitted, but they haven't come to visit or called again since then." My chest tightened painfully at her words, as if someone had placed a heavy weight on it. I had fully expected my sister to stay away after what she had deliberately done to me, given that she was directly responsible for my condition. But my parents? The realization cut deep. I thought about my father, who had always been emotionally distant and cold, and my mother, who consistently sided with her obvious favorite daughter no matter what the circumstances. Did they say anything at all? I asked, already dreading whatever answer might come, knowing deep down it wouldn't be what I hoped to hear. The nurse looked away uncomfortably, unable to meet my eyes directly. "They said you brought this situation on yourself, that you had shamed them and the family name," she finally admitted quietly. I lay there motionless, staring blankly at the plain ceiling tiles above me, those cruel words cutting far deeper than the physical injuries from the fall ever could. My own parents, the people who should have loved me unconditionally, were dismissing me as if I was completely worthless, as if I meant nothing at all to them. I thought back to the contract, that moment of pure triumph and achievement that now felt completely tainted and poisoned by my sister's jealousy and violent actions. She hadn't just physically pushed me down those stairs. She had deliberately tried to erase me from existence, to eliminate me as a threat or obstacle. And my parents, the very people who should have been sitting at my bedside day and night, praying fervently for my recovery, had instead turned their backs on me entirely, choosing to abandon me in my moment of greatest need. I clenched my fists tightly, feeling my nails dig into my palms. The physical pain radiating through my battered body was absolutely nothing compared to the deep, crushing betrayal that had pierced my heart. As the days continued to drag on with agonizing slowness, my sense of isolation only grew heavier and more suffocating. The sterile hospital room increasingly felt like a confining cage, its plain white walls seeming to close in around me as I lay there hour after hour, my body still aching and recovering from the traumatic fall. Not a single person from my family appeared or reached out. Not my parents, not my sister, not anyone. I kept glancing hopefully at the closed door, desperately hoping that someone would care enough to walk through it, that someone would show they valued me, but it remained firmly shut, a barrier between me and the world outside. The nurses moved quietly and efficiently through their daily routines, their activities becoming nothing more than a blur of medical procedures and vital sign checks, and I was left completely alone with my thoughts, endlessly replaying and analyzing the sharp sting of my family's profound betrayal. I had always been cast as the outsider in their eyes, perpetually overshadowed and diminished by my sister's superficial charm and their parents' obvious favoritism. But their complete absence now, during this critical time, cut far deeper than any previous slight or dismissal ever had. I found myself wondering obsessively whether they even knew I had woken up from the coma, or if they simply didn't care enough to find out, having already written me off entirely. One morning, without any warning or announcement, my sister suddenly appeared in my doorway. She stood positioned at the very edge of my bed, her arms folded defensively across her chest, a disturbing smirk twisting her features. "Still managing to cling to life, huh?" she said, her voice deliberately sharp and cold, designed to wound. "You're holding everyone back, you know. You're just a burden now." Pain flared intensely in my injured leg as I attempted to shift my position, glaring at her with as much strength as I could muster. "Why are you even here?" I demanded, my throat feeling tight with emotion and barely suppressed anger. She leaned closer, invading my space once again, her eyes glinting with something dark and malicious. "Just making absolutely sure you stay out of my way from now on," she said with chilling calmness, then abruptly straightened up and walked out of the room without another word, leaving me alone once again with the echo of her threats hanging in the air. Her footsteps echoed ominously as she departed, fading down the hospital corridor. Her words weren't merely cruel or meant to hurt me. They carried a substantial weight, an undertone that suggested she was carefully guarding some kind of secret, concealing something important. I clenched the thin bed sheet tightly in my fists, feeling my anger beginning to simmer just below the surface. She wasn't simply mocking me or taking pleasure in my vulnerable state. She was definitely up to something, planning something sinister that I couldn't yet fully comprehend. Later that same week, my best friend finally managed to slip quietly into my room, her face visibly drawn and etched with deep worry and concern for my well-being. She approached my bedside carefully and hugged me gently, being extremely cautious not to jostle or disturb my still healing injuries, then settled into the chair position beside my bed. "I've been fighting desperately to see you," she said, her voice deliberately kept low and hushed. "The hospital staff kept blocking me and turning me away until now. I've tried every single day." I felt an overwhelming rush of relief wash over me. Her presence felt like a genuine lifeline being thrown to me in this desperately lonely and isolating place where I'd been abandoned. Then she proceeded to drop an absolute bomb of information on me. "Your sister has been talking constantly at work," she said, her eyes narrowing with obvious anger and disgust. "She's been telling everyone and anyone who will listen that she's taking over your $10 million contract, acting like it's completely hers now, like she's the one who created it." My stomach churned violently at the revelation. My algorithm, the innovative program I had painstakingly built entirely from scratch over years of dedicated work, was being brazenly claimed by her as her own creation. "She's been saying repeatedly that she's the one who made it all happen, who deserves all the credit," my best friend added, her voice tight and strained with disgust at the audacity. The full realization of what was happening hit me hard, like a physical blow. My sister wasn't just gloating about my misfortune or enjoying my suffering. She was actively and deliberately trying to steal my entire legacy, everything I had worked to build. That night, feeling a desperate need to take some kind of action, I grabbed my phone from the bedside table, wincing noticeably as my fingers fumbled awkwardly with the screen due to my weakened state. I needed urgently to check my bank account, hoping to be able to cover at least some of the mounting hospital costs and regain even just a small shred of control over my life and finances. The banking app loaded slowly, and then suddenly a bright red alert flashed prominently across the screen. "Account frozen." My heart began to pound heavily in my chest. I immediately called the bank's customer service line, my voice noticeably shaking with anxiety and fear, and the representative's words absolutely chilled me to my core. "A court order has frozen your funds," she stated matter-of-factly. "It specifically cites serious concerns about your mental and financial ability to manage them properly." Ability? I had just barely woken from a medically induced coma, fighting desperately to survive each day, and now someone was deliberately trying to paint me as incompetent and unable to handle my own affairs. My sister's recent visit to my hospital room, her smugly confident demeanor, and her boastful claims being spread around at work all suddenly clicked sharply into place in my mind. Everything was beginning to make perfect, terrible sense. This wasn't merely abandonment or neglect anymore. This was something far more calculated and malicious. A week later, a complete stranger walked purposefully into my hospital room without any prior announcement. He introduced himself professionally as my lawyer, a well-dressed man appearing to be in his mid-30s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, measured voice that inspired confidence. He carried a thick, heavy folder stuffed with documents, his expression remaining serious and businesslike as he carefully sat down in the chair position beside my bed. "I'm here specifically about your contract situation," he said directly, sliding a substantial stack of papers across the bed toward me. My heart raced frantically as I began scanning through the documents with growing horror. They were official legal forms, properly stamped and notarized, formally declaring me legally incapacitated and completely unable to manage my own personal affairs. My signature was scrawled clearly at the bottom of each page, but I had absolutely never signed any of these documents in my life. "These were officially filed with the court to transfer your entire $10 million deal to another party," he said, his tone remaining steady but distinctly grim and concerned. "Someone is systematically trying to take absolutely everything from you, every cent you've earned." I gripped the papers tightly, my mind spinning wildly as I tried to process this information. My sister's disturbing smirk from her hospital visit flashed vividly in my head. This entire scheme had her name written all over it, her fingerprints on every aspect. I asked my lawyer directly how exactly he had found me and come to be representing my interests. He explained patiently that a concerned colleague at my company, someone who had grown worried about my sudden and unexplained absence from work, had personally hired him to investigate the situation thoroughly. "The court order freezing your bank account was merely just the start of this," he said seriously, flipping methodically to another page in his thick folder. "These additional documents claim explicitly that you're completely unfit to work or function professionally, and they base this assertion on your medical records." I stared at him in stunned silence, my initial disbelief rapidly turning to deep dread. My medical records. I had barely been conscious and awake for a single week, still recovering from major trauma, and someone was already actively and aggressively rewriting my entire story, constructing a false narrative. My lawyer leaned forward intently, his voice dropping to a low, confidential tone. "We absolutely need to dig much deeper into this situation, but from what I can see so far, this looks entirely deliberate and premeditated." I nodded firmly, feeling my anger steadily rising like a tide within me. My sister wasn't just attempting to steal my contract and my money. She was systematically trying to completely erase my competence, my professional reputation, my very identity as a capable person. That same afternoon, a doctor came specifically to see me, arriving with a purpose. She was a woman in her mid-40s with a kind face but resolute, determined demeanor, and she introduced herself as the primary physician who had overseen my medical care since admission. "I found something quite troubling during a routine review," she said seriously, pulling up my detailed medical chart on a tablet device. "Your medical records were deliberately altered after you were initially admitted to this hospital." My breath caught sharply in my throat. She pointed carefully to specific entries in the digital chart, showing documentation of extended sedation periods and grossly exaggerated neurological issues and complications, absolutely none of which actually matched my real recovery trajectory or current condition. "Someone with access specifically added these false entries to make it appear as though you would never wake up from the coma, that your condition was hopeless," she said, her eyes meeting mine directly with concern and sympathy. "It's precisely why the court order went through the legal system so fast, without proper scrutiny or challenge." I felt a distinct chill run down my spine. This wasn't simply about money or the contract anymore. This was about keeping me completely out of the picture permanently, eliminating me as a factor in my own life. As I lay there in the hospital bed, processing all this information, the pieces of a larger puzzle started to connect and form a clear picture. My sister had always been intensely controlling, exhibiting this behavior pattern ever since we were young children growing up together. I vividly remembered her at just 6 years old, aggressively snatching my favorite doll right out of my hands and claiming it boldly as hers, smirking with satisfaction as our parents actually praised her enthusiastically for being assertive and strong-willed. By the time she was 10, she had completely mastered the art of turning their attention deliberately away from me, convincing them easily and repeatedly that I was always the problem, the troublemaker, whenever I dared to speak up or advocate for myself. As we grew into teenagers, she would skillfully manipulate virtually every family decision, from vacation plans to who deserved to get the bigger bedroom, always expertly painting me as the selfish one, the unreasonable one in any disagreement. My parents never once questioned her version of events or her motives. They absolutely adored her outward confidence, her superficial charm, her ability to present herself well. I had spent countless years desperately trying to prove myself worthy of their attention and approval, pouring my energy into building my revolutionary AI algorithm specifically to show definitively that I was so much more than just her shadow, more than the overlooked younger sibling. But now she had taken her controlling behavior to an entirely new level, carefully orchestrating an elaborate plan designed to systematically strip me of absolutely everything I had rightfully earned through my own hard work and dedication. I looked back and forth between my lawyer and the doctor, studying their faces which remained steady and filled with determination to help me. They believed in me genuinely and completely, even when my own flesh and blood family absolutely didn't. The forged legal documents, the deliberately altered medical records, it was all unmistakably my sister's doing, her handiwork, with my parents likely turning a convenient blind eye as they had always done throughout our entire lives together. I thought about her arrogant boasts at work, spreading lies to our colleagues, and her deliberately cruel words spoken to me here in the hospital room, designed to break my spirit. She thought she had won, that I would stay broken and defeated, crushed under the weight of her betrayal. But she had seriously underestimated me, misjudged my strength and determination. I handed the stack of papers back to my lawyer with renewed purpose, my voice firm and steady despite everything I had been through. "We're fighting this," I declared clearly. "We're going to fight this with everything we have." He nodded in agreement, a small spark of admiration lighting up in his eyes. The doctor promised solemnly to document thoroughly every single discrepancy and irregularity she could find in my medical records. I wasn't just fighting for my contract and the money anymore. I was fighting for my life, my identity, my right to exist as my own person. Determined to fight back against this injustice, I took a bold and risky step. Still physically weak from my injuries and recovery, but fueled by righteous anger and determination, I checked myself out of the hospital against the strong medical advice of my care team and arranged to meet my sister at a quiet, relatively secluded Denver cafe. I carefully tucked a small digital voice recorder in my jacket pocket, my heart pounding rapidly with anxiety and adrenaline as I limped slowly through the cafe door, relying on my crutches for support. She was already seated there comfortably, casually sipping her coffee, her posture deliberately relaxed and at ease, but her eyes remained sharp and calculating as always. "You're up and walking around," she said, her tone distinctly mocking and dismissive. "Didn't think you'd actually make it out of that hospital bed, to be honest." I forced a smile onto my face, playing along with her game, and casually asked about how things were going at work, trying to sound natural and unsuspicious. She leaned back confidently in her chair, smirking with obvious satisfaction. "The contract's moving forward smoothly," she stated matter-of-factly. "Someone had to step up and take charge since you're obviously indisposed and unable to handle it." I pressed her further, carefully keeping my voice casual and conversational, not wanting to alert her to my real intentions. "You mean my contract?" I clarified innocently. Her laugh was cold and harsh, lacking any warmth or humanity. "It's mine now," she declared boldly. "You weren't going to make it happen from a hospital bed, were you? Someone had to take over." I clenched my jaw tightly, fighting to maintain my composure while the small recorder hidden in my pocket captured every single word she was saying. She had just openly admitted her deliberate plan to steal my $10 million deal, and I had it all on tape. Back in my temporary apartment, a small furnished place I had rented for my recovery period, I met with a private investigator my lawyer had specifically recommended for this case. She was a woman in her late 30s, sharp-minded and no-nonsense in her approach, with a well-earned reputation and knack for uncovering secrets that people wanted to keep hidden. "I've been digging deep into your sister's personal finances," she said seriously, spreading various bank statements and financial documents systematically across the table. My breath caught sharply as she pointed directly to a series of suspicious payments, large sums of money that had been wired to a colleague at my company. "This man," she said, tapping firmly on a highlighted name on one of the statements, "received $10,000 from your sister's personal account just 3 weeks ago." I immediately recognized the name, a colleague who had always been too eager to please her, always hanging around her desk and volunteering for her projects. "He's been actively forging company documents," she added, her voice filled with disgust. "Making it look like your sister was the actual lead on your algorithm project, the one driving the innovation." My blood boiled with rage. She wasn't just taking credit for my work. She was actively paying other people to help her rewrite history, to construct an entirely false narrative. Later that same day, my best friend called me, her voice sounding urgent and concerned. "I found something you absolutely need to see," she said quickly, immediately forwarding a chain of internal company emails to my personal email account. I opened them on my laptop, my eyes rapidly scanning the screen, taking in the contents with growing horror and fury. In one particularly damning email, my sister had written directly to our boss. "With Grace out of commission, I'm stepping in to replace her and manage the project. The contract's in good hands with me at the helm." Another email brazenly bragged about her supposed vision for the algorithm, describing ideas and innovations as if I had never existed, as if she had conceived everything from the very beginning. My hands shook uncontrollably as I read through her carefully crafted words, each one representing a deep betrayal of our relationship. My best friend's voice broke through my racing thoughts. "She's been planning this entire takeover for weeks, maybe even longer," she said. "Everyone at work actually thinks she's the hero, stepping up in a crisis." I thanked her profusely for uncovering this evidence, my resolve hardening like steel. These emails were concrete proof, undeniable evidence that my sister was systematically trying to erase me completely from my own success story. Determined to leave absolutely no stone unturned in my investigation, I called the hospital's administration office directly. I had been haunted constantly by the doctor's warning about my deliberately altered medical records, and I desperately needed answers about how this could have happened. The administrator, a brisk and professional woman, confirmed my worst suspicions after thoroughly pulling and reviewing my complete file. "There's clear evidence of unauthorized changes," she said, her voice tight with concern and professional alarm. "Entries were added specifically to exaggerate your condition significantly, suggesting you would be incapacitated and unable to function for many months to come." I asked directly who would have had access to my confidential medical records. She hesitated noticeably, clearly uncomfortable, then finally admitted, "Only a few authorized staff members have that level of access, but we're currently investigating an external request that came through what appeared to be a legitimate legal channel." My mind immediately flashed to my sister's extensive connections, her demonstrated ability to manipulate people and systems to get what she wanted. This wasn't just about stealing the contract anymore. It was about keeping me down, trapped and locked away in a false narrative of permanent frailty and incompetence. With substantial evidence now in hand, I prepared myself mentally and emotionally for battle. I sat across from my lawyer in his Denver office, a somewhat cluttered space filled to the brim with legal books, case files, and years of accumulated documents. "We're building a very strong case," he said, his voice steady and confident. "We'll file a comprehensive lawsuit in Denver court charging fraud, conspiracy, and deliberate deprivation of your contractual rights and earnings." I nodded in agreement, my fingers unconsciously tracing the edge of the heavy wooden table, but my chest tightened noticeably with anxiety. Going to court meant directly facing my family, the very people who had betrayed me so completely without a second thought, without any apparent remorse. My lawyer leaned forward intently, his eyes sharp and focused. "The recording is absolutely key to our case," he emphasized. "In Colorado, one-party consent is completely legal, so your cafe conversation with your sister is fully admissible in court as evidence." I exhaled deeply, relieved that my risky move would actually hold up under legal scrutiny and wouldn't be thrown out. He explained carefully that we would present the recording alongside the internal company emails my best friend had uncovered, emails that clearly showed my sister's explicit intent to steal my $10 million deal. "We'll also call the doctor who thoroughly reviewed your medical records," he added. "Her expert testimony will prove conclusively that the alterations were deliberate and malicious." I felt a surge of hope rising within me, but the heavy weight of what lay ahead in the courtroom pressed down on me like a physical burden. This wasn't just about winning the case. It was about confronting directly the family I had once trusted implicitly with my life. Later that day, I met with the doctor in a private hospital conference room. She sat across from me at the conference table, her posture calm and professional, but her facial expression was serious and grave. "I've prepared a detailed written statement," she said, sliding a thick folder across the table my way. "It confirms definitively the unauthorized changes to your records, entries that were added to grossly exaggerate your coma and suggest permanent incapacity and cognitive impairment." I flipped through her meticulous notes, my heart racing as I absorbed the implications. The evidence was absolutely clear and irrefutable. Someone with access and motive had tried to paint me as permanently helpless to justify stripping me of my legal rights. Dr. Price met my gaze directly, her expression resolute. "I'll testify to every single discrepancy, every unauthorized entry," she said firmly. "This wasn't an accident or administrative error. This was deliberate." Her words bolstered my resolve significantly, but they also stirred up a powerful storm of emotions I had buried deep inside, feelings I had been suppressing for years. As I left the hospital building, walking slowly to my car, memories of my family's blatant favoritism flooded back with vivid clarity. I saw my sister at countless family dinners over the years, always positioned at the center of attention, her stories consistently earning my parents' genuine smiles and enthusiastic engagement while my achievements and accomplishments went completely unnoticed and uncommented upon. I remembered her at 16, getting a new car for her birthday while I received a used bicycle. I thought of graduations where her undergraduate degree was celebrated with a party while my advanced degree earned a brief congratulations. The pattern had been there all along, but I had tried to ignore it, tried to believe that hard work and real achievement would eventually win their respect. I remembered vividly the time when I had won a prestigious science fair at just 15 years old, only to have my mother completely dismiss my achievement and instead lavish praise on my sister's mediocre art project. My father would simply nod along in agreement, dismissing all my efforts and accomplishments as not practical or useful in the real world, not worthy of their attention or pride. Their constant and unwavering preference for her had relentlessly pushed me to work harder and harder, to build my revolutionary algorithm, to prove definitively that I was enough, that I was worthy of their love and respect. Now they had sided with her once again, allowing her to manipulate and control my entire life while I fought desperately just to survive and reclaim what was rightfully mine. The pain of their rejection hit me with the force of a massive wave, threatening to completely drown my courage and determination. I stopped at a small park located near the courthouse, needing fresh air and a moment to collect myself. I sat down heavily on a wooden bench, the bitter cold biting through my coat, and allowed myself to actually feel the hurt I had been suppressing. I wasn't just fighting for my contract and the money it represented. I was fighting for the truth, for recognition of the countless years I had spent proving myself worthy. The day of the trial finally arrived, and I was ready, as prepared as I could possibly be. The Denver courtroom buzzed noticeably with tension and anticipation as I sat beside my lawyer, my hands clasped tightly together in my lap to stop them from shaking. My lawyer stood confidently, his voice clear and commanding as he addressed the judge. "We have undeniable evidence of a deliberate conspiracy to defraud my client," he began firmly, immediately presenting the audio recording from the cafe where my sister had openly admitted to stealing my $10 million contract. The audio recording played through the courtroom speakers, her smug, arrogant voice echoing clearly through the entire room for everyone to hear. "It's mine now," her recorded voice stated with unmistakable confidence. Audible gasps rippled through the gallery of observers. My lawyer followed up immediately with the forged company documents, showing in detail how my sister and a colleague named Mark had systematically falsified official records to claim my algorithm as her own work. I glanced across the room at her, observing her face which had gone pale but remained defiant, refusing to show weakness. Next, my lawyer introduced the bank statements into evidence, revealing the suspicious payments my sister had made to Mark, the colleague who now sat rigid and uncomfortable in his seat. "These financial transactions prove clear collusion and conspiracy," my lawyer said, his tone absolutely unwavering. He handed the judge a thick folder containing emails my best friend had courageously uncovered, emails where my sister had brazenly bragged about replacing me and taking over my position. The evidence was completely airtight, each individual piece stacking powerfully against her, building an undeniable case. Then the doctor took the witness stand to testify. Dr. Price spoke calmly and professionally, her words precise and measured. The medical records were deliberately altered to significantly exaggerate Ms. Harper's condition, she stated clearly, holding up the relevant charts for the judge to examine. False entries were added suggesting permanent incapacity, which were then used to justify the court order filed against her. The judge's eyes narrowed with obvious displeasure, and I felt a genuine spark of hope ignite within me. The truth was finally unraveling before everyone's eyes. My sister stood to defend herself, her voice sharp but noticeably unsteady and lacking its usual confidence. "I was protecting the company and its interests," she claimed defensively, her eyes darting nervously to the judge. Grace was unstable, completely unfit to lead such an important project. Her lies stung painfully, but they crumbled quickly under the weight of scrutiny and cross-examination. Mark followed her to testify, stammering awkwardly through his weak defense. "I was just following orders," he said quietly, deliberately avoiding my direct gaze. His pathetically weak excuse only deepened the judge's frown of disapproval. I watched my parents sitting in the courtroom gallery, their faces displaying a complex mix of shock and denial. My mother clutched my father's arm tightly, her lips trembling visibly with emotion. My father stared straight ahead, his usual cold and distant demeanor finally cracking under the pressure. They had enabled my sister's behavior for years and years, but now their complicity and favoritism was laid completely bare for everyone to witness and judge. My lawyer called me to testify on my own behalf. My heart pounded frantically as I took the witness stand, facing the entire room. I spoke clearly about my algorithm, describing the years of dedicated work I had poured into developing it, and the devastating betrayal of being violently pushed down the stairs by my own sister. I described in detail waking up in the hospital after 2 weeks in a coma, feeling abandoned by my entire family, and then discovering their elaborate plot to strip me of absolutely everything I had earned. They thought I would stay silent, that I would simply accept this, I said, my voice remaining steady despite the deep ache in my chest. But I'm here today for justice. The courtroom fell completely silent, the full weight of my words sinking in deeply. My sister glared at me with obvious hatred, her previous confidence rapidly fading away. My parents looked away uncomfortably, unable to meet my eyes directly. For the first time in my entire life, I felt the power dynamics shift decisively in my favor. The judge deliberated carefully, the minutes stretching out like hours of agonizing waiting. Finally, she delivered her verdict with authority. "The evidence presented is absolutely overwhelming," she said, her voice firm and resolute. The defendant orchestrated a calculated and malicious scheme to defraud Miss Harper of her intellectual property and her financial rights. She sentenced my sister to 4 full years in prison for fraud and conspiracy charges. Mark received a sentence of 2 years for his active role in forging the documents. I exhaled deeply, relief washing over me in waves, but the judge wasn't finished yet. As for the parents, she continued seriously, their involvement in enabling this scheme warrants a separate civil lawsuit for damages. My mother gasped audibly, burying her face in her trembling hands. My father's shoulders slumped in defeat, his usual air of authority completely shattered. As the gavel struck with finality, I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. The courtroom slowly emptied, but I stayed in my seat, watching my family leave in complete disgrace. My sister's defiant mask had finally cracked, her eyes now hollow and empty. Mark shuffled out quietly, his head bowed in shame. My parents, once so dismissive and superior, now faced the serious consequences of their years of favoritism and enabling behavior. I had fought courageously for my truth, and I had won decisively. The contract was mine once again, my name and reputation fully restored. But more importantly than that, I had reclaimed my inner strength and sense of self-worth. I walked out of the courthouse slowly, the Denver sky bright and clear above me, feeling ready to rebuild my life on my own terms. With justice finally served, I began an entirely new chapter of my life. I stood in my new apartment, a small but bright living space with large windows overlooking the impressive city skyline. The walls were still bare and undecorated, but they held enormous promise, a genuine fresh start, completely free from the dark shadows of my family's betrayal. I had made the deliberate decision to cut all ties with them permanently. No more phone calls, no more obligatory visits, no more desperately hoping for their approval and acceptance. My sister, my parents, they were all part of a painful past I no longer needed or wanted in my life. The freedom of that choice felt like breathing freely for the first time in years. The legal consequences for them had been appropriately severe. My sister was currently serving a 4-year prison sentence for her crimes. Mark had been sentenced to 2 years behind bars. My parents faced a substantial civil lawsuit that would likely drain their savings and retirement funds. But beyond the legal penalties, they had lost something far more valuable. They had lost their credibility, their standing in the community, and any claim to moral authority. The truth about their favoritism and enabling had become public knowledge, and they would carry that shame for the rest of their lives. I had chosen not to visit my sister in prison, nor had I responded to the few letters she attempted to send me. My parents had tried reaching out several times through intermediaries, but I remained firm in my boundaries. They wanted forgiveness, perhaps, or maybe just a return to the old dynamic where they could pretend everything was fine. But I was done pretending, done accommodating their dysfunction. This wasn't about revenge or punishment, it was about protecting myself and honoring my own worth. Her once burning ambition had been reduced to the confines of a prison cell. The court had ordered her to pay me $200,000 in restitution for all the damage and harm she had deliberately caused. Mark, the colleague who had served as her willing pawn in this scheme, now faced 2 years behind bars and a substantial $20,000 fine for his active role in forging the documents. My parents, who had been complicit through their deliberate silence and willful blindness, were hit hard with a civil judgment that ordered them to pay $75,000 in damages. Their once proud reputation in our community crumbled rapidly, their previously respected status completely eroded by their own choices and actions. I didn't gloat over their misfortune. I felt absolutely no joy or satisfaction in witnessing their downfall. But I did feel profound relief, knowing with certainty that they could no longer hurt me or control my life in any way. I wanted to do more than simply rebuild my own life from the ground up. The deep pain of being betrayed so completely, of being left utterly alone in that hospital bed to suffer, had shown me clearly how many others might be facing similar struggles without support or resources. I took a bold and meaningful step, investing $500,000 from my hard-earned contract earnings into establishing a Denver-based foundation specifically dedicated to victims of familial abuse. The fund would provide comprehensive legal aid, professional counseling services, and safe housing options for those desperately trying to escape toxic family situations. At the official launch event, I spoke directly to a small but engaged crowd, my voice steady and clear despite the emotions. No one should ever feel alone in their fight, I said, the words carrying the weight of my own deep scars and experiences. The foundation was my way of transforming pain into genuine purpose, ensuring that others would have the support and resources I had so desperately lacked during my darkest hours. As I settled gradually into my new home, I took time to reflect deeply on the incredible journey I had endured. My family had tried systematically to erase me, my sister with her elaborate schemes and manipulations, my parents with their cold indifference and complicity, but their actions had only succeeded in making me stronger and more resilient. I had fought my way through a 2-week coma, uncovered all their lies and deceptions, and faced them courageously in court. Each step along the way had been its own battle, from secretly recording my sister's damning confession to presenting compelling evidence alongside my lawyer. I had learned through this ordeal that justice wasn't just about winning in court. It was fundamentally about standing up for yourself, about refusing to be silenced or erased. Even when the odds seemed absolutely impossible and overwhelming, I had persevered. My algorithm, my greatest pride and achievement, was back securely in my hands, and I was already actively planning its next phase of development, absolutely determined to make it bigger and more impactful than ever before. The biggest lesson I learned wasn't about revenge or triumph over my enemies. It was about genuine self-reliance and inner strength. For years and years, I had desperately sought my family's validation, constantly chasing after their love and approval through achievements they consistently ignored and dismissed. But in that sterile hospital bed, abandoned and betrayed by those who should have loved me most, I discovered something far better and more valuable: my own intrinsic strength. I didn't need their approval to know my fundamental worth as a person. My tenacity had carried me through everything, through the physical pain, through the web of lies, through the intimidating courtroom proceedings. It had taught me the invaluable lesson that no one could take my future away unless I allowed them to, unless I gave them that power. As I stood looking out over Denver, watching the city lights sparkling beautifully below in the gathering darkness, I knew with absolute certainty that I was enough exactly as I was. I was ready and eager to build a meaningful life on my own terms, one where no one could ever hold me back or diminish me again. The future stretched before me, full of possibilities, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly free.